So the next speaker is John Robson. He's a columnist with the National Post and a talk radio contributor, and believes we shouldn't place much stock in the United Nations. John.
Well, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here. It's a marvelous conference. I think I may, to some extent, be rowing against the current here, or possibly straight up a waterfall, because I have no dazzling disruptions to offer you. I don't know that I want to live forever on the moon with titanium bones, eating hamburgers made from plants and having ears made from plants. On the other hand, I am crowdfunded. I too have a Patreon, although unlike Butterscotch, I couldn't play a trumpet even if I had one up on stage, never mind if I didn't. But I'm not here to cast a pall of gloom over an eternity of Riemann surface tennis and centrifugal bumble puppy. I'm here to cast a pall of gloom over the United Nations, to ask, what is this thing? It certainly is, rhetorically at least, a cornerstone of Canadian foreign policy. We love multilateralism. Nothing is more multilateral than the United Nations, and we tend to endorse it without giving a whole lot of thought to what we're saying, which is a bit of a habit in Canadian foreign policy, what Roy Rempel's called dreamland. Our foreign minister just gave a major speech on the anniversary of D-Day. Apparently soft power is out. She didn't say where it came from, but something else is in. And in the course of that speech, she said, force is, of course, always a last resort. Well, if force is a last resort, then the second last one is ignominious surrender, right? It's an ordinal ranking. It's the last one. You never do it. I'm not sure she was thinking very hard when she said it. I don't know how that got past a whole committee of speechwriters. But I do want to try and think a little bit about the UN, clearly and fundamentally. And my time is short, so I need to talk fast. Do you have a question about the UN as well? Yeah, not that fast. The question of what the UN is, I'm tempted in the spirit of Candide to say it's an organization devoted to driving us insane, especially arguably those who place the most hope in it. Robert Conquest once said the best way to explain the behavior of any large organization is to assume it is secretly controlled by a cabal of its enemies. And the UN is forever feeding its critics with outrageous stories. But it is a meeting place for illegitimate sovereign states. That's what happens at the United Nations. That's who gathers there. There are some legitimate sovereign states, like Canada, that go there, but most of them are not. And that is why the UN is openly contemptuous of human rights. It is a collection of governments that are themselves openly contemptuous of human rights, including the right not to be governed without your consent. But I think what really matters here isn't what the UN is, it's what it's not. Oh, sorry, I want to say yes. Conrad Black called it the now perversely corrupt and absurd United Nations, a primal scream therapy center for the world's most egregious despotisms and kleptocracies. Which reminds me of that line from Star Trek II, don't mince words, Bones. What do you really think? And since you ask what I thought in 1999, when someone said you're more likely to see the UN building dismantled brick by brick and thrown into the Atlantic than to see NATO pilots go before a UN tribunal, I said, so some good may come of this after all. Quoted Abba Eban. I'll quote David Ben-Gurion, whose response to the whole thing was schmoom. And the problem, as I say, it's what the UN is not. The UN is not a world government. The UN is not the conscience of mankind or its police force. And the UN is not a better place to make decisions than Parliament Hill. Our foreign policy is premised on the fact that it is a world government, that it is the conscience and police force of mankind, and that it's a better place to make decisions than Parliament Hill. And those are all wrong. You might think that the second combines 2 points, that it is not the conscience or police force of mankind, but really, they are two sides of the same phenomenon. Because a government is an entity that claims and enforces a monopoly on the legitimate use of force within a jurisdiction, which in this case would be the planet Earth. It's a body with a legislature, an executive, which has to include that police force, and a judiciary. And ideally, and we are blessed to enjoy this here in Canada, it is an entity that enjoys the consent of its people. And manifestly, the UN does none of these things. It's not a government at all. It's a good thing, too. I don't want a world government. My favorite line about this comes from Milton Friedman from a conference where Bertrand Juvenal told Friedman that he'd always been an ardent advocate of world government until the day he crossed the border into Switzerland ahead of the pursuing Nazis. National sovereignty is a good thing in an imperfect world. It means there can be places that are relatively good, even in a world much of which is not relatively good. Refugees come to Canada. They couldn't do that if there wasn't a Canada, could they? It is a good thing that Canada is a sovereign entity. And if we did have a world government, by the way, if it was the size of the British House of Commons, which I think is the upper size for an effectively functioning legislature, there would be all the legislators and we'd be the three little red dots. We would have no say in the affairs of the world or in the affairs of Canada. Why would we want that? What's so wrong with Canada that we would like to give up our right to make the rules under which we live? Including in that speech by our foreign minister, and I don't agree with all of this, but that's a subject for another day. She is talking about how our foreign policy is based on feminism, safe and accessible abortions. These abortions apparently at the core of our foreign policy. I can think of things I'd rather see there, but a great many governments that are present at the United Nations don't share these goals. If we were in that parliament I showed you, these would not be our goals. So even from her own point of view, it would be a bad thing. If we did have an effective world government, what would we gain? What suggestion that is made at the United Nations can we not adopt right now if it's a good one? What bad idea suggested there can we not reject as things stand? What alliance or treaty can we not make if it is in our interest as a sovereign nation and as people? Is it all about a vague feeling of moral superiority? Robert Frost once said that a liberal is a man so broad-minded he won't take his own side in a quarrel. And I sometimes feel that our government feels that way, that there is something dirty about standing up for Canada. Well, I have a rather different view of the matter. Now, time being so short, I don't want to go through what the UN is actually like. This is a thing they tweeted about some girl in Gaza whose life is made miserable by Israeli occupation or blockade. However, as they knew perfectly well, it's actually from Syria. Its agencies are corrupt beyond belief. The World Health Organization deliberately holds, especially on the subject of Israel, positive news, and anti-Semitism is a real canary in a coal mine here. It even passed a Security Council resolution saying that there was no legal connection between Israel and East Jerusalem, also known as Old Jerusalem. So the Security Council, 14 in favor, Barack Obama's United States abstaining, said, yeah, basically there never was a temple on the Temple Mount. This is not an organization that has any moral legitimacy, in my view. And then, yeah, Saudi Arabia is on the Human Rights Council. It's also on ECOSOC's Commission on the Status of Women, and Sudan is on ECOSOC's Committee on Non-Governmental Organizations. The rot goes from top to bottom. So the UN is not a world government. Canada wouldn't be better off if it was a world government. Our self-government is built on the rock of Magna Carta. So I leave you with the words of Edward Cook in his great parliamentary speech in 1628 on the Petition of Right. He said, "This nation has a law appropriate to the kingdom. If you tell me of other laws, you are gone." Well, so is my time, and I wish the United Nations were as well. Thank you.